Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
So right now, the world's leading killer is it's actually quietly building up inside the arteries of perfectly healthy high school students.
Yeah, it's a terrifying thought.
Right. And for decades, the medical community's approach to this was essentially just to wait. Like wait until the damage was already done.
Exactly. Wait until you're in your 40s or 50s, run a blood test, and then, try to manage the fallout.
But as of April 2026, the entire rulebook has essentially been rewritten.
It really has. It is a monumental shift in how we think about longevity.
Which is why we're doing this. Welcome to today's deep dive, where our mission is to unpack the major changes in these brand new recommendations.
Right, because the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association just completely replaced their 2018 guidelines.
Yeah, they published this huge update in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. And if you know how to read these new rules, you actually understand the absolute newest science of how to protect your heart.
The medical community is definitely still digesting the implications of it all.
Oh, I bet. Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we get into the new 2026 rules, I feel like we should make sure we're visualizing the actual biology correctly.
That's a great idea, yeah.
Because I think a lot of us, we grew up with this slightly flawed mental model of what high cholesterol actually does.
That is very true. The common misconception is that cholesterol, specifically LDL, the low-density lipoprotein, that it just floats around in your blood.
Right, like a bunch of rogue garbage trucks just dumping trash in the middle of the street.
Exactly, like a traffic jam in the middle of a highway just blocking the cars.
But looking at the sources, that's not actually how the blockages form at all. It's way more insidious than that.
Far more insidious, because the LDL particles don't just sit in the bloodstream, they actually seep into the walls of your arteries.
Wait, into the actual wall?
Yes, right into the walls. Your blood vessels have this really delicate inner lining called the endothelium.
Huh?
And when there's too much LDL circulating, those particles penetrate that lining and literally get stuck inside the wall of the pipe.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And your body recognizes that as foreign damage, right? So it sends white blood cells to attack it. Those cells consume the cholesterol, they die, and they form this inflammatory fatty streak inside the wall itself.
Okay, so it's not a traffic jam in the middle of the street.
Not at all.
It's more like, okay, think of it like corrosive water seeping into the actual lining of your house's plumbing.
That's a great way to put it.
Like the pipes aren't getting blocked by debris floating in the water. The walls of the pipes themselves are swelling inward, like they're rusting and blistering from the inside out until the water just can't flow.
That is a much more accurate way to look at it, yes.
And then the HDL, the high-density lipoprotein, which we call the good cholesterol, that's basically the chemical solvent your body produces, right?
Right.
Like a street sweeper to pull that corrosive LDL back out of the pipe walls and carry it to the liver to be destroyed.
Exactly. You have this constant dynamic between the LDL seeking into the walls and the HDL trying to pull it back out.
Right.
And what's fascinating here is that cardiologists aren't changing their understanding of that plumbing. The biology is the same.
So what are they changing?
What they're completely rethinking is the concept of cumulative exposure over a human lifespan when we send those street sweepers out.
Which brings us right into the first major change in the recommendations. Because the sources keep emphasizing this massive shift toward proactive prevention much, much earlier in life.
Right.
They are now explicitly recommending early screenings, specifically for anyone with a family history of heart disease or high cholesterol. And they're starting medication earlier in certain cases. So why the sudden urgency to look at teenagers?
Well, it really comes down to a mathematical concept called area under the curve.
Area under the curve, okay.
Yeah. In medicine, we use this to talk about cumulative exposure. So think about sun damage to your skin.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Getting a severe sunburn one weekend is bad, sure. But being exposed to moderate, unprotected UV radiation every single day for 30 years.
That's going to cause profound cellular damage.
Precisely. And your arteries react to LDL in a very similar way.
So having mildly elevated bad cholesterol for 3 decades is actually mathematically worse for your plumbing than having, severely high cholesterol for just 5 years.
Exactly. And this is the great realization that's driving these April 2026 guidelines.
Wow.
Pamela Morris, who is a cardiologist at the Medical University of South Carolina, she pointed out in the sources that high cholesterol begins to impact your heart disease risk in adolescence.
In adolescence, that is crazy.
The foundation for those blistering, swollen artery walls is literally being laid when you're in high school.
So if a doctor waits until you're 45 to start treating mildly high LDL,
Your blood vessels have already endured 30 years of cumulative damage.
that completely reframes how we should look at this.
It really does.
I mean, the old way was like waiting for a pothole to completely wreck your car's suspension before you bother fixing the road.
Right.
And these new guidelines are saying, no, we need to start sealing the cracks in the pavement while you're still a teenager.
Yeah, exactly. Seth Martin, he's a leading cardiologist from the Johns Hopkins Cicerone Center. He noted that shifting to these proactive prevention strategies earlier in life can meaningfully change the trajectory of the disease decades later.
Makes sense.
Because if you lower the area under the curve in someone's 20s, you are physically altering the structural health of their arteries when they hit their 60s.
Okay, hold on, though. I'm stuck on something here.
Sure. What is it?
Because here's where it gets really interesting, but also a bit confusing.
Okay.
If this damage starts in high school, and a 20-year-old might feel perfectly fine while their arteries are quietly absorbing this LDL, how are doctors supposed to actually measure that invisible buildup today?
Right.
Because, I mean, if the physical structure of our hearts hasn't changed since 2018, why do doctors suddenly need new guidelines and updated thresholds to figure out if we're sick?
Well, it's because the tools we were using to measure that risk were simply too blunt.
Blunt how?
They were looking at the wrong time horizons entirely. So the guidelines have officially introduced a major change in the clinical tools doctors use. They are now recommending a complete switch to what are called PREVENT scores.
PREVENT. That stands for predicting risk of cardiovascular disease events, correct?
Yes, exactly. And what's interesting is PREVENT was actually introduced for assessing people with high blood pressure back in August 2025.
Oh, right.
But now it's become the absolute gold standard for cholesterol, too, completely replacing the older risk calculators.
Okay, so what was wrong with the older 2018 models?
The main problem with the 2018 models is that they primarily calculated a patient's risk of having a heart attack over the next 10 years.
I see where this is going.
Right, because if you run a 10-year risk calculation on a 25-year-old,
The calculator is basically going to say their risk of a massive heart attack by age 35 is practically zero.
exactly. Even if that 25-year-old has LDL rapidly seeping into their arterial walls right at that moment.
The old calculator just told the doctor, don't worry about it yet.
Exactly. Come back in 10 years.
Yeah.
But PREVENT changes the math entirely. It allows doctors to calculate 30-year risk horizons and even lifetime risk.
Oh, wow.
It's specifically designed to capture that area under the curve we just talked about.
So it's zooming out to look at the entire lifespan of the plumbing rather than just asking, hey, is the pipe going to burst in the next decade?
Precisely.
But how does the PREVENT score actually do that? Like, what variables is it looking at that the old calculators missed?
It represents a massive leap in personalized medicine. Instead of just looking at, your age, your sex, and a static snapshot of your lipid numbers, PREVENT incorporates broader metabolic and systemic health markers. For example, it factors in kidney function.
Kidney function? Really?
Yes, your kidneys and your heart are intimately connected. So if your estimated glomerular filtration rate,
Wait, your what?
your eGFR, it's basically a measure of how well your kidneys filter blood.
Got
If that rate is declining, it strongly indicates systemic vascular issues.
That actually makes a lot of sense because the blood vessels in your kidneys are incredibly delicate, right? So if they're taking damage, the larger vessels in your heart are probably suffering too.
Exactly. And PREVENT also factors in highly specific historical variables, like a patient's personal history of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, or ASCVD.
ASCVD, yeah.
It looks at whether the plaque buildup has already caused micro events. So by synthesizing all these variables, kidney health, metabolic markers, lifetime risk horizons, the calculator provides a highly individualized risk level.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all threshold anymore.
Not at all. It tells the doctor not just if they should intervene, but exactly when.
And according to these new rules, that when is much, much earlier.
Right.
But I want to zoom out from the clinical tools for a second and look at the actual stakes of this disease for you, the listener. Because we are talking about ASCVD, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, and the numbers in our source material regarding how widespread this is are just staggering.
They are incredibly sobering. It is estimated that 1 in 4 adults in the U.S. currently have elevated LDL cholesterol.
Wait, 1 in 4?
1 in 4 adults.
Just process that for a second. 25% of the adult population is actively dealing with a plumbing system that has corrosive LDL seeping into the walls faster than their bodies can clear it out.
Yep. And that elevated LDL directly fuels ASCVD, which, as you said earlier, remains the #1 leading cause of death globally.
Not just in the US.
No, worldwide, it is the primary way human beings pass away.
But here is the massive silver lining in all the data we're looking at. The sources note that around 80% of cardiovascular disease is thought to be preventable.
That's right.
80%.
It's an incredible figure. And this is where we really have to highlight the part of the medical advice that has not changed one bit since 2018. Roger Blumenthal, who's another leading expert at Johns Hopkins, he stated clearly in the wake of these new guidelines. Lower LDL cholesterol levels are better when it comes to reducing the risk of heart attacks, strokes, and congestive heart failure.
So lower is always better.
Yes. And the biological reality of how we achieve those lower levels remains deeply rooted in our daily habits.
So what are the actual constants then? If the timeline has changed and the calculators have changed, what is the fundamental advice for keeping the LDL out of the artery walls?
It is the exact same foundation cardiologists have preached for decades. Eat a heart-healthy diet rich in fiber, right? Because fiber helps bind cholesterol in the gut.
Okay.
Engage in regular cardiovascular exercise to maintain the flexibility of the endothelium. Maintain a healthy weight. Prioritize high-quality sleep to reduce systemic inflammation.
Right.
And absolutely, under no circumstances, smoke. Because the chemicals in smoke directly damage the arterial lining, making it incredibly porous and easy for LDL to invade.
Honestly, I have to push back on human nature here.
Oh, you...
Because it feels like we are constantly hunting for a high-tech shortcut. You know, like we love the idea of a shiny new Prevent Score app on our phones.
Yeah, that's very true.
And we get super excited about new drug candidates, which the sources do note are currently showing real promise in clinical trials for people who have genetic predispositions.
They are, yes.
But we completely ignore the boring foundational stuff. We have these highly advanced medical guidelines, but 80% of the world's leading killer is preventable if we just, like, sleep 7 hours, eat more fiber, move our bodies, and put down the cigarettes.
It is the great paradox of modern medicine.
Right.
We have brilliantly complex ways of measuring risk down to the exact metabolic marker. But the primary interventions are incredibly basic.
Yeah.
And the guidelines are very clear about this reality. For some people, lifestyle changes simply aren't enough because their liver naturally overproduces LDL due to their genetics.
Right. Some people just draw a bad hand genetically.
Exactly. And in those cases, cholesterol-lowering drugs are a brilliant necessary addition. But the drugs are an addition to the foundation, not a replacement for it.
Because you can't out-medicate a lifestyle that is actively destroying your pipes.
No, you can't.
Like, if you are chronically sleep-deprived, your body is bathed in cortisol and inflammation, which just makes the artery walls sticky and vulnerable anyway.
Exactly.
The fundamental mechanics of the body don't care how advanced your doctor's calculator is.
No, they don't. And as cardiologists understand more about how our daily behaviors physically alter those mechanics, they are forced to keep adapting the rules.
Which brings us to perhaps the most interesting part of this 2026 update, the horizon. Like, where are these guidelines heading next?
Right, because human behavior definitely doesn't stand still.
Exactly. And alongside the main guidelines published in April, the experts released a really vital companion paper called The ABCs of Cardiovascular Disease Prevention.
Yes, that paper is crucial.
And this paper proves that cardiologists are looking way past just standard lipid numbers now.
Definitely, because it reviews the absolute latest evidence on how modern lifestyle shifts intersect with cholesterol. They're looking closely at the specific mechanisms of how things like diabetes, alcohol intake, and body fat levels actively accelerate the rusting of those pipes.
Let's actually dig into those mechanisms, starting with alcohol. Because for a long time, the public perception, and I definitely believe this, was that a glass of red wine was somehow actively good for your heart.
Yeah, that was a very popular idea.
So what is the latest science saying about how alcohol actually interacts with our lipid panels?
Well, the science has become much more precise. When you consume alcohol, your liver essentially drops everything else it's doing to metabolize the ethanol.
Because the body views it as a toxin, right?
Exactly. And while the liver is busy processing the alcohol, it stops processing fats.
Oh.
This leads to a spike in triglycerides, which is another type of fat in your blood. Elevated triglycerides, combined with LDL, create a highly atherogenic environment.
Atherogenic, meaning it causes atherosclerosis.
Yes, meaning it rapidly accelerates the buildup of plaque, So the companion paper makes it clear that minimizing alcohol is a direct lever you can pull to improve your lipid metabolism.
And they also spend a significant amount of time in this paper discussing body fat, but not in the way we traditionally think about it.
Right.
The authors explicitly acknowledge that the clinical definition of obesity needs to be refined.
This is a major area of evolution in cardiology right now, because historically, obesity was just a measure of mass, your body mass index or BMI.
It's pretty flawed, yeah.
Very flawed. Cardiologists now understand that not all fat is created equal. They are highly focused on visceral fat.
Visceral fat, that's the fat stored deep inside the abdomen, right?
Exactly, around your organs.
Yeah.
Visceral fat is not just inert energy storage. It acts almost like an endocrine organ itself.
Wait, really?
Yes,
Wow.
It actively pumps out inflammatory cytokines into your bloodstream.
Oh, wow. And those inflammatory signals are what tell the delicate lining of your arteries to swell up, making it easier for the LDL to seep in.
Exactly. The location of the fat and its metabolic activity are far more dangerous to your heart than just a number on a scale. So, as the medical field refines its understanding of metabolic health, the definition of what puts someone at risk is shifting dramatically.
But the most fascinating part of this companion paper to me is just the humility of it.
How do you mean?
Well, the authors openly admit that their own brand new 2026 recommendations are soon going to need to evolve all over again, because there are massive blind spots in the data regarding modern habits.
Oh, yes.
Specifically, they point to vaping and cannabis use.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, medical guidelines are always just a reflection of the data available at the time.
Yeah.
And right now, the medical field simply does not fully understand the long-term cardiovascular risks posed by these newer habits.
It's wild to think about. I mean, you see people vaping on the sidewalk every single day, but to the world's top cardiologists, those devices are still giant question marks.
They really are. We just don't have the 30-year longitudinal studies yet to know exactly what inhaling those specific vaporized chemicals does to the endothelial lining of our blood vessels.
Right, because we know combustible tobacco destroys the arteries. We've known that forever.
Exactly. But the exact inflammatory response triggered by e-cigarettes or by regular cannabis use is still being mapped out. The companion paper is essentially putting a bookmark in these topics.
Signaling to the medical community that, hey, we need to watch this.
Right, signaling that these will likely be the primary drivers of the next major guideline update in the 2030s.
It makes you wonder how those highly personalized prevent risk scores are going to adapt once that data finally comes in.
It definitely will be
I
interesting.
mean, right now, the calculator looks at your kidney function and your past history of plaque. But in 10 years, is the algorithm going to literally ask exactly how many years you vaped in your 20s to calculate your risk of a stroke in your 50s?
It is almost certain that environmental and modern lifestyle exposures will be integrated into future risk models. The team behind these new guidelines stated that their hope is that by giving doctors better tools like Prevent Today, they can recognize patients at risk earlier and alter their trajectory.
Buying time while the science continues to catch up with our rapidly changing habits.
Exactly.
Which perfectly encapsulates the core takeaway for you listening today. The April 2026 guidelines from the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association, they are not just tweaking the dosages of statins.
No, not at all.
They represent a massive paradigm shift. The medical community is officially moving away from a system of reactive treatment, waiting for the pipes to burst when you're 50.
Right.
And moving to a system of proactive, highly personalized prevention that starts calculating your lifetime risk before you even graduate college.
By understanding the cumulative exposure of LDL, looking closely at systemic markers like kidney health, and utilizing the 30-year horizons of the Prevent scores, cardiologists are mounting a much more aggressive, intelligent defense against the world's leading killer.
But I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder today, something that builds on that incredible 80% statistic we discussed earlier.
Okay.
Because we know that atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease is the primary way human beings currently pass away. And we just learned that a staggering 80% of it is theoretically preventable through these early interventions and fundamental lifestyle choices.
Yeah.
So imagine a world where this paradigm shift actually works on a global scale.
Wow.
If the medical community successfully utilizes early screenings to catch the damage in our teens, and we actually adhere to the preventative lifestyle measures to neutralize 80% of these cases, what happens to global demographics?
That's a huge question.
If we effectively cure the primary mechanism that ends human life today, simply by protecting our arterial plumbing from the very beginning, how drastically will our definition of a normal human lifespan change over the next 30 years?
It's a profound implication.
Yeah.
I mean, if we solve the plumbing, the natural ceiling of human longevity could be fundamentally raised for an entire generation.
Exactly. Something to think about the next time you get your blood work done or, the next time you're deciding between a walk and the couch.
Definitely.
Well, until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and take care of those pipes.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.